Good evening, everybody. This is an overflow crowd, and I'm so happy to see you. I'm Barbara Stevenson. I'm the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Chief Global Officer here at Carolina. I am truly overjoyed to see so many of you here tonight to discuss this complicated and incredibly nuanced topic, information warfare. Last year, I had the privilege of participating in the NATO Summit Public Forum in Washington, D.C. There, world leaders, including memorably the Danish Prime Minister, implored us to think more seriously and critically about disinformation, misinformation, hybrid warfare, information warfare, and everything else that falls into that whole kettle of fish. We have framed tonight's discussion around the term information warfare, and that's not perfect. It means different things to different people, and we'll talk about that tonight. But it encapsulates the urgency and severity of this issue set, as well as the tactical application of information that we find prevalent today. I want to tell you something tonight, especially our students. Something important has changed. I did not grow up in a world or a country in which nothing seemed true. And I spent my diplomatic career as a political officer, separating signal from noise in my reports from abroad back to Washington. So I'm particularly skilled at figuring out and summarizing what really happened. And yet I struggle amidst the noise to figure out what really happened to, say, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to take just one example. Even for me, a seasoned and skilled gleaner of what really happened, of the truth, you might say, I struggle with nothing seeming true. The information environment has changed and changed radically. We cannot apply old solutions to new challenges. It is, as the Danish Prime Minister said last summer, high time we got serious about grappling with this new challenge. And that's why we're here to listen and learn tonight. We have two of Carolina's best minds to help us with that, Jennifer Davis and Daniel Kreiss. Jen is a double Tar Heel and longtime champion of the Diplomacy Initiative. This year, she's serving as the Diplomacy Initiative Faculty Fellow in UNC Global Affairs and as the Knott, K-N-O-T-T, the Knott Distinguished Professor of the Practice in Peace, War, and Defense. After her earning her undergrad and law degrees from UNC-Chapel Hill, Jen pursued an extraordinary career in the U.S. Foreign Service, where I had the pleasure of getting to know and admire her. She's well-versed in media and banking law, as well as international perspectives on media literacy, and she's ready to offer us valuable insight into the global dimensions of disinformation. Daniel Kreiss is the Edgar Thomas Cato Distinguished Professor in the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. He's a prolific researcher and writer and a sought-after speaker on how political communication and digital platforms shape and are shaped by disinformation in the public space. Daniel also co-founded CITAP, the Center for Information Technology and Public Life here at Carolina. I love any opportunity to work with Daniel and the center, and I'm glad tonight that they have partnered with UNC Global Affairs to organize this diplomatic discussion. So in just a minute, Jen will come to the stage to share some thoughts with you. Daniel will follow her, and then the three of us will have some more conversation before inviting questions from the audience. So take it away, Jen.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Good evening. It is such a pleasure to be with you tonight as a double Tar Heel. Barbara, thank you for that very gracious welcome. I can't tell you what it's like to be here in the southern part of heaven with all of you, talking about these really challenging and very timely issues. So as Daniel and I discussed the best way to present tonight, we thought it would be helpful if I start with some definitional and foundational discussion of the topic broadly, and then I share with you some of my experiences as a U.S. diplomat and how they affected me in my thinking on the challenge to democracies from disinformation and why democracies are particularly vulnerable to information warfare. And we're going to talk about the whole lexicon that Barbara went through and what those terms mean. But first, if you'll come with me, we're going to go across the Atlantic. And if you can, use your imagination for a moment and picture that you are arriving in Istanbul, Turkey in July 2016. You are the new US Consul General there. There has just been an attempted coup in Turkey. It only lasted 24 hours and was put down quickly, but it traumatized the Turkish public and hundreds of Turks lost their life. Russian disinformation agents saw a moment of opportunity, and shortly after the attempted coup, they spread disinformation that the United States had not only known about the coup, but that we supported the coup. This was absolutely false. We supported the democratically elected government of Turkey, and it did significant harm to our relationship with a NATO ally and a close friend. You are the new US Consul General, and you have just showed up, and it's your job to debunk that disinformation. If you can imagine it, I can share with you that I can also imagine it, because that Consul General was yours truly. And it was an incredibly difficult moment in my career. And as a patriotic American diplomat, it was so difficult for me to see the enormous harm caused to our national interests by disinformation used by our strategic adversaries. And we had very little recourse. And I have dedicated myself to thinking about why and what more we can do. So let's dive in. The first thing in any discussion about disinformation has to be, what are facts? And it may seem like it's hard to remember what facts are. And that is, of course, because of our 24-hour cable news cycle and social media. And so much of our media now blends fact and opinion that we've forgotten a bit what facts are. But facts have characteristics, and I want us all to believe in facts again. And I think these are important characteristics of what facts are, but the important thing to remember about facts is they're the things that we can see and measure and smell and hear. They are apolitical. They are about things that have happened. And the important thing in a democracy, of course, is that we can all have different opinions about facts, but we can't have different facts. So why are facts or the truth important in a democracy? And if you hadn't read Timothy Snyder's on tyranny, I recommend it wholeheartedly to you. But number 10 and number 11 in his book on how to avoid tyranny are to believe in truth, to believe in facts, and to investigate. And what Schneider talks about in his prologue is that the founders studied the democracies that had come before them and failed. And they built into our system checks and balances so that we could avoid some of the failures of the past. And of course, to the founders, information and our use in a healthy democracy of information was very important to them. In fact, so important that it's in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And they felt like, as responsible citizens, not only did we need to be responsible for the information and the veracity of the information that we receive, but also what we share. And poignantly, he says that post-truth, a term we've heard quite a bit, post-truth is pre-fascism. And I want to talk about the differences in information networks. And for this slide, I really drew a lot on Yuval Noah Harari's new book, Nexus, which I really recommend as well. And he talks about the different information networks that two different political systems use, autocracies and democracies. And they use information very differently, and it plays itself out in every aspect of our polity. And in autocracies, of course, information is very centralized. It comes from the government, it goes to citizens, it comes from citizens back to the government. It's all very controlled, it's surveillance heavy. And because autocracies don't have a habit of thinking critically or speaking in dissent, they have a really fragile innovation system. And that's why, for example, many autocracies will steal the intellectual property of democracies, because they don't have the muscles, the critical thinking to innovate. And also, of course, in autocracies, the media is controlled. I have lived and visited countries where the presidential palace puts out the talking points for the next day's newspapers, and that's what appears in the next day's newspapers. It's really chilling and difficult to see those things happen, especially if you come from a democracy where the media has historically been free. And one aspect of this that I want to also note is that autocracies do have an advantage, and that's that they have fast decision-making processes. And for anyone who's worked in the US government, you'll know that ours are painfully slow. One of our problems in Turkey was that it took us 3 or 4 days to clear a statement about the attempted coup because it had to go to so many different people, and that's why we were slow to respond. And we are lumbering, and it takes us a long time, but that's because of the pluralism of the voices involved in our decision-making. So you have heard, I'm sure, so many words in this space, and I want to take a minute and just define a few of them for you. And what I want to share first is that misinformation and disinformation are two different things. They're often used interchangeably, but misinformation lacks intent. So your Uncle Ted probably shares some misinformation from time to time. And it is not his intent to share misinformation or to deceive. And that's the difference. With disinformation, there is an intent on the part of the actor to deceive. Information operations is the very broad framework under which all of this language and these terms fall. It can mean anything from public diplomacy, what we diplomats say about our country to other people, that some might say, our enemies might say is propaganda, but we might say is just telling people about our country, all the way over to really harmful disinformation operations. Influence operations are those operations that are targeted at a democracy's political system. It is intended to achieve a political outcome. So for an example would be if an autocratic government used a troll farm or bots to interfere in the public of a democracy in order to achieve a certain political outcome. That's an influence operation. And active measures is the term of art when we take disinformation and we couple it with military action. And of course, the famous example of this is Russia's little green men who operated in the first invasion of Ukraine in 2013-14, and they appeared without any insignia, and that was referred to as hybrid warfare because then they pushed forward narratives about who those people were and that they were not Russian soldiers. I just added here too the US military's phrases for using information as a support for combat. And I just want to add that it's as old as time, going back to ancient Greece. The Soviets, over the last century in the Cold War, were expert at what they called active measures. And active measures, these three gentlemen are KGB defectors who came to the United States, and there are wonderful interviews with them on YouTube if you have free time. But they explained what active measures were. And they explained that a large percentage of the KGB during the Cold War was dedicated only to disinformation operations. And they were very different than the modern form that I'll talk about in 1 minute. These were very targeted. The intent of these disinformation operations or active measures was to deceive with a particular narrative. The Soviet Union would use a foreign newspaper, for example. In a famous instance, they placed in an Indian newspaper a story about the CIA having created the AIDS virus to kill millions of people around the world. They then amplified it, and it took off and became sort of common knowledge around the world that the United States had created the AIDS virus. And it was harmful, so harmful that Ronald Reagan brought it up in a meeting with Gorbachev and asked him to stop. And right after that, the disinformation about that plot ended. But the Soviets were always particularly good at this kind of disinformation, of sowing a story that was picked up and spread and became true to certain leaders. So I tell this because the Cold War teaches us that disinformation is not new. But what is new is social media. And I'm going to date myself, but when I was a student here, we hardly had email. We had just gotten email. We didn't have social media. It's hard to think of a time when we didn't have social media, but I was a US diplomat when these companies here came online. And these were innovations of democracies, right? This was Silicon Valley coming up with brilliant ideas about how to share information. And the 2000s were really heady days for social media. And many of you may remember, we all thought that social media was going to be a panacea for many of the world's biggest problems, that it was going to bring people together, that it was going to help people unite and protest and overthrow autocratic governments. We saw the Arab Spring, and we all thought that this was a moment when social media and the internet were going to carry us forward in a period in which democracies had been on the rise for decades. In the 2000s, there were more democracies on earth than at any other time in history. That trend has reversed itself. And now very much democracies are essentially on their back foot, and it feels as if autocracy is ascendant. And that is because in the 2010s, the autocracies strike back. And if you heard Darth Vader's theme song when I said that, you are my friend. But this is where we saw autocracies notice that social media was a threat to them, was a danger to them, and then they used it for their own purposes, and they did it very successfully. And what we saw is autocracies using the internet and social media not only to close off their own information space. So there's something called the Great Firewall of China, in which the Chinese government very much controls what comes in and out of China and what their people see. But we also saw autocratic governments using their information systems to surveil, to quash dissent, to use point systems, really draconian measures that limited the amount of information that their populations could get. And then we saw them very cleverly, and this is your humble consul general arriving in Turkey, we saw them very cleverly using troll farms, bots, and AI, not only to sow discord in our own democracy, which we saw any number of times in that decade, but also to harm us in our relationships with our allies and partners, and they were using it very effectively. But there was something fundamentally different about the way they were using it, and this is where I'll leave you. And that is, the Russians have switched to something that Rand calls a firehood of falsehood approach, which is different from active measures. And the goal now is quite different for Russia or China in their disinformation operations. And China, by the way, didn't use disinformation operations in the same way that the Soviet Union did, and is really only in the past 5 to 7 years taken on disinformation operations, often parroting the disinformation talking points of Russia. But largely before that, their use of social media was to hail China as a good ally and an excellent economic, thriving partner. And then we see in the past 5 to 7 years a real switch into the disinformation environment, and they are now very successfully using AI for their disinformation. And because they're so advanced with AI, it will be a significant threat to our democracy. But the goal of these information operations is not to make us believe something false. It is to give us information vertigo, to make us feel like nothing is true. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that most days. And they've done significant harm to our democracy. And we ourselves have done harm to our democracy as well. And with that, let me turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Jen. First, I want to say that it is an honor to follow in the footsteps of two really brilliant public servants who've done so much in service to the United States. And it's an honor to be here in front of all of you My name is Daniel Kreiss. I'm at the UNC Center for Information Technology and Public Life, which is housed in the School of Information Library Science here on campus. What I want to talk about is picking up some of the themes that Jen left us with to talk specifically about the crisis of democratic accountability. Information warfare matters because democratic accountability is at stake. First of all, what's going on? What lies at the root of contemporary democratic crises, right? We hear lots of claims about autocracy, democratic backsliding, et cetera. What is actually happening? What we see across countries around the world, including the United States, is what political scientists call executive aggrandizement. What does that mean? It means when somebody who is in office strengthens the power of that office and systematically dismantles the checks and balances that come from other branches of government, that come from civil society, and that come from elections. This is what we're seeing in countries such as the United States, but also many others. It's happening in India. It's happening in El Salvador. It is currently the case in Hungary. And it almost completely happened in Brazil. I want to return to that at the end today because Brazil has been successfully walking back its most dangerous threats to democracy. Fundamentally, executive aggrandizement is a crisis of accountability. What do I mean by accountability? There's four elements of this generally. What do we expect of our democratic leaders, our leaders who are in office and who are in power? The first is basic transparency. What, when, and where happens with respect to governance and governing? Why do executives take the action that they do? Why do the agencies that they're a part of take the actions that they do, right? That leads us to explanation, which is the why. So what happened? That's transparency. Why? Why did these things happen in this particular order when an executive is in charge? And three, justification, right? What are the acceptable reasons for why an executive did what they did? And that could be all sorts of things. It could be law, it could be morals, it could be democratic standards, ethics, norms, et cetera. And finally, we expect in a democracy, even over our elected leaders, that there should be some form of sanction if there aren't adequate justifications for the actions that they ultimately took. There's consequences. What do those consequences look like? Well, we see a number of different forms of accountability, right? Three primary ways. First, electoral accountability to the people. If voters don't like what an elected leader did, they can vote him out of office, right? If somebody in office violated the public trust or engaged in corruption or mismanagement, ultimately they can vote that leader out of office in a democratic system. We have institutional forms of accountability, right? In an actively functioning democracy, even elected leaders are subject to accountability from judicial agencies and judicial bodies and the rule of law. Regulatory and administrative agencies actively check the power of that executive in certain ways. That's why we often have independent regulatory agencies. Other branches of government, such as the Justice Department, historically in countries like the United States, can investigate the executive. And the power of the opposition, right? That party or those parties that are in opposition that can call hearings, that can demand transparency, demand justification, demand sanction. And finally, discursive accountability. This is what exists in civil society, right? And that includes journalism, it includes media, it includes what goes on at universities, but also includes everyone in this room as citizens, as voices that exist in a public, where we can criticize those people that we voted into office, where we can look to hold them accountable, where we can give money to an opposition or do get out the vote activities. That falls under this idea of discursive accountability and is related to freedom of speech. Information warfare undermines all three aspects of accountability. Why? A few things that Jen touched on that I just wanted to build off a little bit more here. First, information warfare erodes the very legitimacy of those public interest knowledge producers, such as journalists and university researchers, and researchers in places like civil society, et cetera. When we no longer trust the people who are tasked with producing knowledge and facts in the public interest, accountable to the public interest, when you no longer trust those knowledge producers, It's a lot harder for those knowledge producers to hold power to account. Second, it manipulates public attitudes and beliefs and weakens public confidence in facts, making it harder to hold those executives accountable. If we can't agree on what's true, if we don't have confidence that those statements, sometimes things we even see in front of us, or things we feel like an unemployment rate or inflation, if we can't trust those things, it's hard to hold those people in power accountable for what they're doing while they're elected to office. 3, information warfare stokes backlash, that us versus them rhetoric, deliberately looking to stoke polarization in order to be evasive of accountability measures. So anytime you hear this us versus them rhetoric, when all of your enemies are them and they're evil people, they're bad people, they're trying to hold me accountable, if you're on that team us, you're going to really be skeptical of that them, even if those people are custodians of the public interest. If they're journalists just trying to get to the bottom of the story, to expose corruption, etc. And finally, information warfare provides foreign actors with those opportunities to manipulate domestic publics, as Jen talked about. So what do we see? Executive aggrandizement is about that weakening of checks on power. Executives in countries around the world, including the United States, they attack those knowledge-producing institutions, and they engage in disinformation, and they take advantage of the structure of media systems in order to weaken those accountability mechanisms over their power. Here's just one example. It's a salient example because we live in this country currently. Trump, for instance, calls his adversaries not just wrong, but evil. This is an existential form of politics. And an existential form of politics means those people in the opposition are not your adversaries in a normal course of democratic debate, but they're actually enemies of the people in some way. And if those people, including journalists and other custodians of the public interest, are looking to hold you accountable, if you think they are actual enemies of the very state that you belong to and believe in, it's a lot harder to trust them in terms of the information they're producing that might hold an elected leader accountable. All of this combines with this structure of media systems. So we talked about social media. What does social media do differently? Social media distorts public debate in very particular ways. It incentivizes short-term attention. We can't focus on the longer, deeper currents of things that are going on in the country. It's a lot harder to focus when every second of the day there is a new scandal. What do we pay attention to? Social media incentivizes this because we have much quicker cycles that can be monetized in certain ways. Social media monetize emotional content. So things that's the most outrageous, those performances of identity and self, in essence, that get us to focus on that and maybe not the underlying hard information that can hold an executive accountable. It tends to amplify the most extremist content, the voices that are most extreme among us, or the ones that can easily be organized in order to take advantage of the situation, particularly to protect executives. We have fragmented audiences, right? In the old days of 3 broadcast networks and a number of different national and regional newspapers, it was a lot easier to all be talking about the same stories, to hold the public's attention, to hold accountability. Now, I don't want to go back to that time, I should be very clear, because the only voices you heard from then were people like me, white males, right? I like the media system that we're in today because it enables a plurality of voices, and that is a good thing. However, that good thing also means fragmentation. And fragmentation means it's also harder for the New York Times or the Washington Post or any other one of trusted information providers to hold audiences and attention that accountability, democratic accountability requires. And finally, it deinstitutionalizes knowledge production. In some cases, that's great, right? We have more pluralistic publics. But in others, we might be hearing from people who might have hidden motives or incentives, such as to get rich, such as to sell you products, or to win a government contract. This is a slide from my colleague, Kate Starbird, at the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. What I wanted to do is just highlight this because it illustrates some of the new dynamics that we're in. We're in a world of participatory disinformation, where disinformation that's circulated by political elites, particularly incumbents looking to avoid accountability, then gets taken up by certain audiences that might have affiliations with them in a partisan way or an identity way or a religious way, whatever that members of a coalition are, who then circulate information back to those elites, who then in turn amplify it. All of which leads us to something like what happened in January 6th. It is a question of political interest and power that takes advantage of the dynamics of contemporary media systems. And where I will end is with this very chilling quote from Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way about where the United States is headed, which is what they call electoral autocracy, where we have competition, but accountability, including electoral accountability, has been undermined to such an extent that we no longer have free and fair elections. And this extends beyond whether someone's going to manipulate something at the ballot box. It stems to when people think twice before they make a public argument, when journalists think twice before they write that article that exposes government corruption, when researchers think twice about publishing an article that might be subject to pulling federal grant funding because it portrays an administration in a bad light. When we have that situation, we no longer have free and fair competition.
So thank you both. So tonight's talk is part of a series of events that we will hold this academic year, exploring the impact of disinformation on democracies. This series will end on March 5 when we will host Anne Applebaum for a diplomatic discussion, partnering with SILS, and it's great to see Jeff Gardsell here, and the Hussman School of Journalism and CITAP and Global Affairs. Anne Applebaum's most recent book, Autocracy, Inc., begins with a chapter with the title, The Greed That Binds. So as we wrestle with tonight's big, difficult, sprawling topic, my first question for the two of you who both read Anne Applebaum's books is, what's greed got to do with it?
Well, a lot, in short. I mean, I think particularly if we're looking at those contemporary dynamics of autocracy, in essence, what we are seeing are forms of crony capitalism. Capitalism where industries will trade off what's in the best interests of their audiences or their publics, et cetera, in order to cozy up to various forms of administration because they'll benefit from it financially. Right? And often that's very short-term thinking, right? Because at the end of the day, Meta, for instance, would much rather operate in a free and fair democracy of the United States than in a country like China, right? Where they have to play by certain state rules. But I think what we're seeing now in countries such as the United States is a intersection of a certain political coalition being grafted onto a certain business coalition. And that is, in essence, helping to keep all these actors in power and sort of driving us to the point where marketplaces are no longer quite as free and fair as they were a year ago.
Jen?
I think greed has so much to do with all of this. And Anne Applebaum is such a profoundly good writer about this topic. And she's written 2 books, Autocracy, Inc. and Twilight of Democracy. And in them, she writes very poignantly about the extent to which autocratic governments who use disinformation to stay in power are often doing so. And the first 2 chapters, by the way, of Autocracy, Inc. are about kleptocracy. They use their position of power that they are maintaining through the use of disinformation. They use it to enrich themselves. And I think with the Pandora Papers, we saw the extensive amount of wealth that our autocratic leaders have. And not only that, they support one another to evade Western sanctions. I have served in a country that was helping a country under U.S. sanctions avoid U.S. sanctions by laundering gold bullion for them. And all of those different autocratic governments are helping one another, and they're doing it to their leaders' great enrichment. So I think in that regard, Greed has everything in the world to do it with it. And I want to just second what Daniel said about our social media platforms. Their algorithms, of course, are tuned to amplify outrage. And the reason that it amplifies outrage is that's what we find addictive. And what we find addictive will keep us coming back to the social media platforms, and that will earn more money for the social media platforms. And I am a huge supporter of technology and of all the wonderful innovations that they have brought to us. But I also think there's more social responsibility in what they are doing in terms of their algorithms and how they're tuned. And I think all of us could benefit from tuning down of outrage that benefits them financially.
The breakdown of accountability creates a really fertile environment for kleptocracy to thrive. So, who is feeling optimistic at this point in tonight's presentation? Who's maybe feeling a little bit of despair? So, despair itself is a product of disinformation. And Jen and Daniel, Jen, so I'm going to start with you. Have you seen people successfully defend their democracy against disinformation? And how did they do it? And what can we learn?
First, I want to say I do feel despair, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to dispense with our despair that has caused apathy and to recognize that we're in a critical moment in our democracy, and that we're not going to be able to face these enormous challenges unless our democracy is healthy once again. And so for the majority of our citizens right now, it feels so overwhelming and so difficult to operate in our polity, so outrage-filled. And I think all of us have to take responsibility for that and have to do more to reach out to one another, to listen to one another, to turn down the outrage. And I think the countries that have done a lot to successfully fight against these trends have done just that. And I think Poland is an excellent example where a party that had some fairly autocratic tendencies that, of course, Anne Applebaum writes poignantly about, was voted out of power and Donald Tusk came back into power. And this was after some pretty shocking turns of event in their polity. And it was because there were people within their civil society who went door to door and talked about media literacy and the danger of disinformation and the danger of attacking the free media. And we've seen, I also just saw Maria Ressa from the Philippines on Jon Stewart. She gave a wonderful interview. She's an inspiration. She was a journalist who fought against an autocratic leader, Duterte, in the Philippines. And Duterte is now at The Hague to stand trial for crimes against humanity. And she was this 5'2" spitfire of a journalist who was jailed and wasn't having it and wrote stories and received the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And I always think of her in my moments of despair and try and summon up a bit more courage. So there are plenty of examples. Brazil's another one. But with that, let me turn it over to Daniel. And I think you have slides even.
Answers that. I'm just going to say when Daniel is done, we're going to turn to question and answer. And there are mics in the aisle. So that's what we'll do. So if you know you've got a question, start thinking it up. You can even start making your way. But Daniel.
Well, I did.
So I'm an academic, right? So, and I'm going to admit it. So what I did a literature review. So everything we know about democratic resilience, what do we know from other countries around the world? I'm not going to talk through all these things. I'm just going to highlight a few things. And I'm happy to send you slides because this is how I find hope, right? And in some particular cases like Benin, Ecuador, South Korea, Poland, Brazil, here's what we know works. So a few things to pull out. First, have democratic clarity. Have the moral certainty that's what's happening is wrong, right? Oftentimes we know autocrats are successful because they keep that blurred line going long enough. It's really hard to mount an opposition to it. We see red flags in the United States right now, for instance. We need clarity about those red flags. The second piece is just have resolve. It's a long fight. It will be in the trenches of doing this work. And we need that resolve. If you're platforms, they could do much better deplatforming people who would undermine the very conditions of existence that enable them to come into being, right? Which is democratic free societies. If you're a journalist, work hard to platform the opposition so that we actually know that there are alternatives to this, right? Call out those suppressions of voices. In civil society, right, those organizations that we're all a part of, right, work to engage the public, your memberships. If you're part of civil associations or clubs, whatever that might be, community groups, talk to people about this face to face. Talk to people about the importance of democracy in those civic associations that enable us to have a rich, meaningful associational life. For universities, craft a narrative about what it is that we do and why it matters, how we speak in the public interest. I'm not the political opposition. I serve the public interest according to the standards of my academic discipline to produce knowledge in the public interest. We need to get off of our campus and we need to engage with people actually in the spaces where they're actually living their lives, right? And we need to move beyond these spaces, which are amazing, but we should gain sustenance from these places to go into the communities that we're from. And finally, what can we all do? We have to defend our democratic institutions. We should think locally. All of us are from somewhere, right? Engage in those communities, the faith groups you're a part of, the geographic communities, the people you grew up with. Engage with them about the importance of democratic norms and affirm those commitments to things like knowledge, right? To things like facts, to things like nonviolence, to things like the peaceful transfer or holding of power. We have to do that painstaking work, often face to face. We have to recreate those bounds of trust so we can get back to being adversaries and not enemies.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Yes, please. Could you just tell us your name and maybe what you're studying, what year you're in?
A public policy student and Hispanic linguistics student. And I'm interested, y'all's thoughts on how we are able to tackle these issues of information without ourselves falling victim to the us versus them mentality, especially in a large polarized society with such a large scale in the United States.
What a great question. I wrestle with it every day. Thankfully, we have our panelists.
Well, first, I want to honor your use of y'all's opinion. I love that. It makes me so happy. I would say that is the most important thing that all of us can do, is to not allow ourselves to fall prey to the us and them mentality. And if you haven't read the work of Jonathan Haidt, I commend it to you, especially his new book, The Anxious Generation. It is about essentially how we became polarized, some of the different ways that conservative thinkers and liberal thinkers, some of the moral foundations from which we think and operate and how they're different, but how we can have respectful conversations with one another and disagree, again, on policy, but in a respectful and caring way that acknowledges that we are all Americans. And we have this 250-year experiment that is precious. In my diplomatic career, I would often go visit President Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. I would talk to him. I would read the Gettysburg Address, and in it, he talks about the unfinished work that we have of living the dream of the framers. I would go there in moments of despair to remind myself that he led us through the other great challenging moment in our history, and that there's room for hope, and that we have to, like he did, reach out to one another, show each other grace, and think about reconciliation instead of fighting with one another in a way that we don't honor each other's humanity.
I could just briefly build off that. It's a great question. I think I would center on how to articulate a bigger us, right? And I think the us is those people who are truly committed to a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. I think that us is a very, very big us. I think that us has been distorted in various ways for certain people's gain. I think the them are people who want to profit off of that us and to gain power in illegitimate ways or raid the public coffers in certain ways. So I would articulate that us as broad as possible. And I also think we have really beautiful civic traditions to draw from in how we do that. And I think what we have to do is we have to think across lines of faith and geography and communities that we're from in order to draw as many connections between the us as we can actually draw in order to win those adherents to democracy, but also clearly call out that there are some among us that are looking to profit from us in certain ways that are anti-democratic, or that are looking to keep us divided in certain ways that are anti-democratic because they want to make the us to be very constrained. So an expansive us, I think there's a majority there. I think it's the vast majority. I'm hopeful for that.
Thank you.
Answer to. You're here for a diplomatic discussion, part of the diplomacy initiative, and we built this in part so that we could practice that skill of listening in the search for common ground. To come back, join us, become a Carolina Diplomacy Fellow. We will brush up on those skills because if we can't knit this back together, our democracy won't hold. Thanks so much for asking that hard question.
Hello. I had a question. Just at the beginning, you talked about the kind of the public relations crisis with the coup in Turkey. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a bit more about that, like how you even begin to solve a problem like that, or any other example where like you have to combat like a huge disinformation narrative.
What's your name?
Oh, my name's Alex Briones. I'm a teacher in the district.
Well, thank you for coming. I hope that I expressed the humility and the shock with which I showed up in Turkey. And it was a problem set that I knew immediately I was going to struggle with for 3 years. Rand has another very good piece about that entire period of Russian disinformation operations. They were also, it wasn't just about the coup. There was disinformation about the ecumenical patriarch who has his seat in Istanbul. There was disinformation about our relationship with fighters against ISIS in Syria. They would claim, Russian agents would claim that we were providing weapons systems to Turkey, to the Kurdish fighters in Syria that we absolutely were not providing. And we were struggling with something that we knew to be true from early literature about disinformation, which is debunking is very hard. Once the anchoring bias is hard at work, a heuristic in which we believe the first thing that we hear about something. Once the confirmation biases are working, it is incredibly hard to debunk. And so one of the things that after I returned from Turkey, I spent a year at Georgetown thinking and writing about this problem and working with the National Security Council. My students briefed the woman at the National Security Council writing the strategy for us on disinformation. And one of the things that we talked about was the importance of pre-bunking. And that is a solution where not only are you constantly telling audiences, it's a media literacy campaign first, you're explaining how disinformation is harmful, how people should check the veracity of sources of where they get their information. And then we saw pre-bunking used very successfully in the Ukraine war about 3 years ago when the United States knew what was going to happen and took the opportunity to tell the world what was about to happen. Russia sat at the Security Council where I was serving at the time and said, that's not going to happen. And then 2 days later, it happened. And it really hurt their credibility at the UN. And it's one of the reasons that our ambassador to the UN was able to assemble such an enormous coalition of countries, including countries in Africa that have a closer relationship with Russia, to say what you're doing is wrong and you're not being honest with us. So there are many tools that we can use. I won't bore you with all of them, but it's a really challenging problem set for American diplomats.
You want to take that on, or you want to take another question?
Hi, my name's Addie Rockoff. I'm a junior studying peace, war, and defense. And I was wondering, I know, especially in America, we have a lot of conversations about media literacy and that as a very big issue with just not just deciphering, but also understanding and comprehending news that we're getting. But further than just in America, on an international platform, like how do we figure out how truthful information, how to digest what we're receiving on an international field?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And if I had a solution to that question, I'd be very wealthy. So I think a few things that I would say about that. So first of all, there are still very trusted information providers, right? So if you're thinking internationally, the BBC, right? I mean, outlets and stories and institutions that work really hard to get the story right. Doesn't mean they always do. Things change rapidly, right? I mean, you talked about in the State Department, right? Not always knowing what's true, but that idea that you actually have people deeply committed to having some form of editorial or other process that helps produce those facts is deeply important, right? I think another piece of that is who do we trust in terms of those institutions that have the public interest fundamentally at heart, right? Not some financial interest, not some political interest. Ultimately, I always look for those custodians of the public interest that like have an ethical commitment to their audience, that they are going to check out certain sets of facts. And then, I mean, I think it's, something we talk about a lot, but like, follow your gut and your intuition, right? Like if something seems like it's going to benefit someone else by you believing something, like look it up, check it out, and rely on, again, those trusted information producers to check it out. It's hard given the millions of pieces of content we see on a regular basis. So it's about being aware, it's about being critical, and it's about cultivating trusted sources and trusted individuals as ways to help us navigate our world.
Can I get a show of hands? How many of you are Carolina Diplomacy Fellows? Great, thanks, welcome. So for all of you, we are actually investing in global affairs this year in a set of publications that we all agree are trusted sources. And I'm actually going to do sessions and read through them with you and get into the habit of going to reliable sources. Foreign affairs, foreign policy. We'll do the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal for the balance, the Financial Times, the Economist, and the Atlantic. And foreign affairs and foreign policy. So those publications will now be available in hard copy. So we want to cultivate this habit and start to go with, where do you go where it isn't just flashing up and you're not sure it's true. There are places, and we want to really take you through that piece of media literacy. We're going to take one last question.
Hello, my name is Ryan Geese. I'm a first-year student in the Transatlantic Master's Program here at UNC. I'm focusing on artificial intelligence and data privacy policy. Prior to coming here, I studied media law at Trinity College Dublin. And one thing that really struck me about Ireland's media system is that they have a very strong commitment to a rigorous and free press. Ireland elevates the media to being a sort of unofficial fourth estate of government, bringing it to much higher standards than that of us. And I've heard a lot of discourse amongst contemporary media scholars about the idea of nationalizing social media platforms as a means to insulate them from the profit motive, separate them from other branches of government, and thus realign social media with its potential as a panacea to unite the people, rather than as a means to drive a wedge. I understand that the growing trend of executive aggrandizement may threaten this, but I was curious if either of you could lend your thoughts on that.
Love to see a realistic pathway toward that, but it's a fantastic question. Who wants to take that?
So I can answer it quickly, which is to say, I think in countries that are not already experiencing significant backsliding, taking an approach where you have strong, let's say, laws, whether that's the Digital Services Act or whether it's what the Brazilian courts are doing now currently to make platforms more liable for information that might harm democracy, including other sorts of categories of information, are a great idea. That's a militant democracy approach, which I'm writing about with my PhD student, Lorcan Neal. However, in countries that already have backsliding and executive aggrandizement, it will be counterproductive. We've already seen this in countries like India, where Modi and the ruling party have passed laws against things like fake news that have simply there to undermine the ability of the opposition to contest elections. So that's my great fear. I think in the United States right now, anything that intrudes on the First Amendment rights of platforms to run their platforms as they see fit, I think you're basically handing over the keys to control civil society to a president that's bent on dismantling checks on his authority.
Can I add just very quickly? I think one thing that I agree, I flinch if I think about government control of platforms, and Europe has been creative in its solution sets to this. But we are quite radical and in a good way in how we promote and defend free speech, including speech that we find difficult or repugnant. And I think that's an important part of our tradition. And the last thing I wanted to say in answer to the question over here is, if you're looking for something to do, you might think about giving media literacy classes around your community, especially our young students who are digital natives. You can go to a retirement community and give a class on media literacy. But these are just a few of the ways that you can get involved. So I really want to urge you to consider doing things like that.
That's great. So I want to say thank you to everyone who took part in tonight's discussion. CITAP, our co-sponsor, Jen Davis and Daniel Kreiss, and really all of you who came and were such a great set of participants. There's going to be pizza in the atrium, and our speakers are going to stay in the atrium during the reception until about 7:15. So there's time for more conversation. Plug for our next diplomatic discussion is going to be October 9. Linda Thomas Greenfield, America's representative to the UN, will be interviewed by her former chief of staff, our very own Jen Davis. So you're going to want to come hear that. It's going to be great. It's going to be in the Great Hall. And then I have these closing words that the three of us, when we discussed it, they said, I needed to come up with this. And what's a reminder, and kind of Jen's comment about going and sitting with President Lincoln sometimes in dark hours and looking for the way forward. It's a reminder of this, that democracy takes work. And the work of forming a more perfect union, or even just a functioning democracy that serves the needs of its citizens, it's hard work, and it's work that has to be renewed. It's never done. And so each new generation has got to take up the mantle and renew the effort. And I have to say, when despair grabs hold of me, because I think it grabs hold of all of us sometimes, really nothing pulls me out of it quite so much as you guys do, because I spend time with you and I see you devote your evening to a conversation like this, and I see you taking up the mantle. And it is a profound honor to get to be part of helping you do that. And I know that Jen and Daniel feel exactly the same way. So go Heels. Thank you for being here.